Well, good morning, folks. What a busy week and weekend I'm coming off of, let me tell you. Not to mention the weekend prior to the last episode, which will come into this week's show, as you'll see in the next half hour or so. I just returned home this past Saturday after a week-long trip to Midland, Texas, where I, along with a few other business partners, facilitated a human performance instructor course of instruction with our client. In this class, we trained some of our clients' employees to perform some of the same function that my partners and I do with their teams. So it's to cover the gaps in time when we, the coaches I work with, are not on location with their small teams in the field. Overall, it was a very productive week, and it relates quite nicely to this week's topic on leadership, as that is one of the focus areas in the course we facilitated. I did encounter a small glitch, though, while down there in Midland. Well, a couple of glitches to be precise. The first glitch I encountered was while I was facilitating the course. And the second one, well, it was during my return trip home this past Saturday. On this week's episode, I will discuss those glitches and how one of them relate to the topic of leadership. I will also discuss many of the takeaways from the East Tennessee Grassroots Leadership Summit, and then I will specifically dive into why I titled this week's episode Opaque Leadership. So, without further ado, let's get on with this week's show of Liberty, Leadership, and Lies. Welcome to a show where we will discuss how the citizens of this republic must continuously fight to maintain our liberty. And those fights are increasingly against our own government. Some of the episodes on liberty will shine a light on exactly how all levels of government are seeking to erode our constitutionally protected rights. We will also discuss the leadership needed to restore our constitutional republic, as well as providing examples of good and bad people in leadership positions in all facets of our society. Additionally, we will discuss the lies the people in positions of power and influence spread every day so they can maintain those same positions. I'm your host, Larry Linton, retired U.S. Navy veteran, small business owner, and candidate for the Tennessee House of Representatives, and this is the Liberty, Leadership, and Lies podcast. Again, good morning, folks, and welcome to this week's show. As I mentioned in the opener, I will go over the events of the past week and a couple of the glitches that I encountered. Specifically, how one of the glitches not only ties into leadership, but more importantly, how it ties into the title of this week's show, Opaque Leadership. Also, one of the main components of the Human Performance Instructor course that I just wrapped up facilitating down in Midland is the topic of leadership and the role it plays in becoming a human performance instructor or a human performance coach. But first, I want to cover down on a couple of the what I call glitches that I encountered last week. The first one that I encountered does not really tie into this week's topic. It was more of a personal nature. In fact, the glitch I encountered is still affecting me today. You see, somehow I injured my left knee on the second day down there in Midland. I do not recall doing anything that brought the injury on either. One minute, I was just sitting down in the hotel lobby waiting for my fellow instructors to head out to dinner on Tuesday afternoon. When I stood up, I noticed the knee was hurting. It started off as just a minor inconvenience, and then we walked a couple of blocks to a restaurant, and it was all downhill from there. Well, not really downhill because it was flat, but anyway, downhill as in pain. Walking back to the hotel was extremely difficult, but I thought with a good night's rest, all would be better in the morning. Well, that wasn't the case. So Wednesday through Friday, while facilitating the course of instruction, it was extremely frustrating that I could not walk around very well. Then came this past Saturday when I started my travel home to my bride. There was a minor delay in my flight out of Midland to Dallas, but nothing like the last one I discussed. It was enough of a delay, though, that caused a bit of anxiety and that I did not want to risk a repeat of that situation, which caused me to walk, well, not run, but walk very quickly to catch my connecting flight. Of course, there was the inevitable tram ride at DFW between terminals as well. With a bum knee that screams in pain for any movement that requires any type of stability, it was very uncomfortable. I made the connecting flight with only an increase in my knee discomfort. We'll see what the professionals have to say about it, though, when I see a doctor about it sometime tomorrow. The pain associated with movement, and as I said, stability movements in particular, has decreased a bit, but I will definitely be getting it checked out. It's probably just something associated with that OLD syndrome that I'm encountering more and more lately, but better safe than sorry, right? But on to the second glitch that definitely ties into the leadership topic of this week's episode. The second glitch came to my attention when traversing the airport in Dallas. Like many of you, I have seen the reports about illegal immigrants being transported all over the country and kind of found it hard to believe that the people in leadership positions within our own government would actually be doing that on such a massive scale. Well, I have firsthand knowledge about that situation now. There were groups of these people all over the DFW airport standing around with packets in hand, a couple of unaccompanied minors as well, with pieces of paper with English directions that they would show to airline staff as well as passengers in the terminal. Only those passengers, though, that looked like they were Hispanic. Not once did any of these groups of people address me or ask for my help. No, not this blonde, well, gray haired guy with blue eyes. In fact, on my flight from Dallas to Knoxville, there were at least 7 people with their packets of papers, most likely provided from some NGO, a non-governmental organization, with directions given in English. One was a group of 4 that appeared to be a family unit, a mom, a dad, and 2 small children. And they were all wearing clothes that had designer or manufacturer labels and logos that I was completely unfamiliar with. Then there was an unaccompanied minor, a teenager, with his packet of paper. Now, if you are familiar with air travel, you will know that unaccompanied minors, along with people that have physical disabilities, as well as people traveling with very small children, they are allowed to board the airplane before they start the general boarding process. So it was not strange that this teenage boy was allowed to board first. What was strange, though, was that the 2 older non-English speaking gentlemen with boarding passes that had them in boarding group 9, the very last boarding group on this very particular flight, they were allowed to board with him, or actually very shortly after him. That's very strange because he was an unaccompanied minor on the flight. You can always pick them out at an airport because an airport employee always escorts them to the gate, and the child has to have travel. They have to travel with this packet wrapped around their neck with a lanyard. But just why would these 2 also non-English speaking older gentlemen be allowed to board the flight right behind this minor? Especially given the fact that their boarding pass clearly had group 9 on it. They were in fact called by name right up to the gate agent right after the child was escorted down the jetway. But now that I have seen this activity with my own eyes, it sort of makes my blood boil even more than when I just heard about it, for a couple of reasons too. Mainly, as many of you know, I travel by air quite frequently. My consulting business takes me all over the country and maybe overseas here in the near future. And in order to avoid the majority of the hassle caused by the boondoggle that is the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA for short, the TSA screening imposed upon American citizens after 9/11, I went ahead and got enrolled in the TSA pre-check program. In fact, both Denise and I got enrolled because we knew that post-military retirement, we would often travel together for vacations now. When I traveled while on active duty, I was automatically provided pre-check status that was tied to my active duty military ID card. I rather enjoyed not having to take off my shoes and completely empty my carry-on baggage of all electronics while standing in line at the airport. My consulting business requires me to bring a lot of electronics, laptops, both personal and company, tablets and associated power cords. And now that I have been putting together this podcast for a couple of years now, there's also the associated gear for that, cameras, microphone, and their associated cords. Anyway, it's a lot of electronic gear that takes some effort to pack into my backpack in an organized and comfortable for carrying manner. And I did not like the idea of some person with very little regard, and in some cases, antipathy for people that have become successful enough to travel frequently, rifling through my backpack in a heavy-handed manner when handing that backpack back to me to repack all over again. Then there was the fact about the long lines to stand in while traveling by air. After all, I had had enough of standing in line to do anything while I was on active duty. But TSA PreCheck has some associated costs with it, both monetarily as well as in personal time and travel. To get PreCheck status, you have to pay a fee for it initially, and then a renewal fee every 5 years. You also need to get fingerprinted and have a background check completed. Those fingerprint locations are often nowhere near where a person lives, as well as they only perform those functions on certain days. More on this on the other side of the next break, though. With that, I'll be right back. Okay, folks, we're back. And as I said in the previous segment, there's time, effort, and money associated with obtaining the TSA PreCheck status. So Denise and I went through all of that to get our TSA PreCheck status. It was some extra screening and money on the front end in order to get the benefits of less time and hassle at the airport. What about those illegal immigrants, though? No identification at all. And if they go through any screening process, it isn't with the passengers in the regular lines at all. I did not see any of those groups of illegal immigrants standing in the lines that every other legal citizen or people in this country legally have to stand in order to enter the departure gate areas of the airport. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what the leadership in our republic is doing to the regular citizens, the tax-paying citizens. Yes, folks, our tax dollars are just enabling the evasion happening at our southern border. It is paying for what I actually saw happening in our nation's airports. You and I, and every other tax-paying citizen in our nation, we all pay for our own air travel. And if you are traveling by air and want to avoid some of the hassle of long wait times and security lines, as well as to not having to take your shoes off and have your backpacks or carry-on luggage rifled through, mainly by people that could not hack it in the private sector, so they work for the government, you pay for the TSA PreCheck status with time, money, and effort. That is definitely not the case with these illegal immigrants. But just exactly how are we paying for the illegal aliens to get better, in fact, preferred treatment at airports around the country? You might be asking yourself, well, how am I paying for this? Aren't the NGOs paying for it? Well, just how do you think the NGOs get their money? Where does their funding come from? It isn't just coming from people like George Soros or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. Nope, the central government provides these NGOs with grants. Remember, where the central government gets their funding. Yep, through the confiscatory and coercive taxes it imposes on the law-abiding, legal citizens of this country, meaning you and me. So the next time you see an illegal immigrant enjoying a perk that you do not enjoy, you paid for it. Some way, somehow, the central government, those usurpers of liberty in Washington, D.C., they have not only enabled and facilitated everything to do with this invasion, they are in fact funding it. And each of our individual state governments has rolled over and showed their soft underbelly to the central government by doing nothing to prevent DC from flooding their states with these illegal immigrants. The commies at the state and national level are working overtime to fundamentally transform, their words, not mine, they are working overtime to fundamentally transform, meaning destroy, our constitutional republic. Because there are ways that the states themselves can push back on this flood, removing the incentives like free public education, social welfare programs. They can remove that for illegal immigrants. Will they do it? Of course they won't. Because those same communists and their trans-publican allies need this demographics is destiny, or more appropriately named replacement theory, to be successful so that they can ensure they stay in power. But in the rest of this segment, I will recap a lot of what was discussed during the second annual East Tennessee Grassroots Leadership Summit that was hosted by Empowered Severe. I mentioned that I attended the summit during last week's show, but I really wanted time to digest what I learned there and refresh my mind with the large volume of notes I did take while I was there. Of course, there were a lot of great speakers at the summit, but for me, that was not the best part of that day. For me, the best part was that my bride sat along beside me during the entire event. For those of you in the audience that know my better half, you are absolutely certain that these type of events are not Denise's cup of tea. In fact, they are the opposite of that for her. Most of the time, when I bring a family member along to these types of political events, it's usually my daughter that goes with me. Kaylee is much more politically involved than Denise. That may change, though, after what Denise heard and saw at this event. This summit may prove to be one of those cool uncle or cool aunt type of events for Denise. What I mean by that is this. Imagine, and many of you don't have to imagine this because it has happened to you at one time or another. Imagine that you have been telling your son or daughter about a certain way to do things or behaviors they should or should not engage in. You repeat these things over and over, but the advice just doesn't seem to stick with it. However, your brother or sister, in fact, any of your relatives come over and they tell your kids the exact same thing. And all of a sudden, it is cool to take their advice and do that certain thing or change that certain behavior because they heard it from somebody else and not their parents. Well, as you can imagine, I discuss a lot of things having to do with government overreach, abuse of power, and usurpations of liberty here at home. Denise gets to hear that all of the time from me. In fact, she limits the amount of time I can spend discussing those items in the house. Well, she heard a lot of the exact same discussions along with examples of government actions at the summit and found it completely interesting. I don't know if it will result in a change in attitude toward attending these functions with me, but she definitely found almost every single one of the speakers to be engaging and informative. Only time will tell, though. For me, some of the best information or discussion came from Pastor Keith Nix, State Representative Brian Ritchie, and State Senator Frank Niceley, which we'll get to probably in the next segment, and Gary Humble of Tennessee Stands. All of the other speakers had some great information as well. Some tidbits from Josh Taylor of the Christian Educators Association and Kathy Harms of the Tennessee Fair Election Coalition. They provided some great information that I'll most likely cover down on a future episode. Andrea Gomez from Citizens for Renewing America demonstrated to the audience the very dark web of how our state and our nation's education system, they are destroying familial bonds and exploiting children in their data mining schemes. There were many other great speakers as well. The vendors that were present also had some great information and products. All in all, it was a very informative day. A video recording of the event did take place, which will soon be out on Severe TV. Once it is, I will share the link to it on all of my social media pages. If you live here in East Tennessee and miss the event, be sure to watch it when it is posted. I've got more on the event, specifically Representative Ritchie's comments that definitely tie into this week's show in the next segment. But it's time to take a break, so I'll be right back after this brief pause. Okay, folks, we're back, and I want to start this segment off with this. The elected members of the Tennessee GOP did it again. By that, I mean they did the voters wrong, which is something we're quite accustomed to. Specifically, the members of the GOP that serve in the Tennessee House of Representatives. We aren't going to let the Republicans in the Senate off either because they benefit from this particular letdown that occurred in the House last week. Now, when Representative Ritchie spoke at the leadership summit I discussed in the previous segment, he passed on some very important information that should concern the voters here in Tennessee, and more specifically, the Republican voters in House District 11. So if you live in Hamlin or Jefferson counties and Jerry Faison is your state representative, pay close attention to the following. Representative Faison also serves as the Majority Caucus Chairman. In that position, he plays a significant role with each newly elected or freshman Republican representative. While these freshmen are going through their indoctrination process in the General Assembly, Chairman Faison gets to speak to them. And one of the first things he tells each of them is this, that their number one job is to get reelected. It isn't securing the people's liberty, which is the primary function of government in a constitutional republic. It is the reason why many people vote to put these clowns into office. But note, Faison's instruction to every newly elected Republican state representative is that their number one job is to get reelected. Isn't that just special? I'm quite sure that it isn't only Representative Faison that holds that viewpoint either. It has become quite evident that a majority of the GOP members in the Tennessee General Assembly subscribe to that same manner of thinking. And this manner of thinking is not just limited to government officials just in Tennessee, but all across the republic. That is one of the reasons our country is in the mess it is in right now. Not the main reason, which we all know or should know, is apathy. And while apathy is the main reason for what ails our state and our republic, there are many factors that contribute to that apathy. Maybe the bit of information I'm discussing will help some of the Republican voters shake off their apathy, especially those that live in Hamlin and Jefferson counties once they listen to this. Also, the voters in the 44th House District, which is in Sumner County. But what I'm about to say is a major contributor to the problems in our state and in our nation as they relate to government and government functions. The problem is this: senior leadership of every political party is only concerned with getting reelected. And it is a problem that the apathy of the electorate only exacerbates because it keeps these usurpers in elected office. Securing the people's liberty doesn't even rank high on the list of job priorities for these elected officials. In fact, it probably doesn't rank at all. Please keep in mind this guy's position in the General Assembly. He's the Majority Caucus Chairman. He, along with House GOP Majority Leader William Lamberth, definitely subscribe to that way of thinking, as we will soon discover. Now, exactly how does that mindset, the one that says re-election is the priority for every member of the House, how does that tie in with what I'm discussing? Well, let me tell you. At the beginning of this regular session of the General Assembly, a proposed rule change was introduced that would be beneficial to the people of this state. It was a rule that all proposed legislation would be subjected to roll call votes in committee. That would mean that every voter in Tennessee would know exactly how their elected representative voted on good and bad pieces of legislation. As it stood before this rule change was proposed, all votes in committee were voice votes only. This allowed the chairman of each committee to determine that the success or failure of every piece of legislation that came before the committee. So it was up to the sole discretion of that individual to advance or kill bills based upon what they, quote unquote, heard. In other words, these chairmen were like mini despots. They controlled the bills all by themselves. This method of voting also did not allow the citizens to know how each member on the committee voted. It just would be reported that the yeas carried the bill or that the noes killed the bills. Quite convenient for those members come election time. There was no record of how they voted in committee. They could do the bidding of whoever wanted to advance or kill bills. And oftentimes that bidding was done on behalf of lobbyists or members of the GOP leadership who were doing the bidding of lobbyists. It was the opposite of transparency. That is the reason why bills at both the state and federal level pass or get killed. It isn't because the constituents want the bills passed or killed. It is because a lobbyist or whoever they represent want a bill passed or killed. We are no longer living under constitutional governance. We are living under corporate or lobbyist governance. And rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, your liberty, your freedom does not matter one bit to the people these lobbyists represent. At some point in the future, we will even discuss how your tax dollars fund some of this lobbying, because the executive branch of government has people on the payroll, which is funded by the taxes we pay. The executive branch of government pays people to lobby the legislative branch of government to pass or kill bills they want passed or killed. Now, how does this tie into Majority Leader Lamberth and Representative Faison? Well, both of them can only survive in their positions if the voters that put them there do not know exactly how they vote. That's true for nearly every member of the House of Representatives. Now, on the Senate side, they do have roll call votes in committee, so each member there has a voting record. But they benefit from this House rule being in place about voice voting, because they know the only pieces of legislation that survive House committee votes are the ones that the lobbyists want to advance in that chamber. Well, you can already guess what happened to that proposed rule change that would force transparency on the elected members of the House. It died on a voice vote, even though Majority Leader Lamberth promised to have a roll call vote on it. Quite convenient, right? Now, with that, I'm going to take a quick break before I come back for closing out the show with God's Word. We'll be right back. Well, folks, that's all I have time for this week. As always, I want to thank you for joining this week. First, I want to thank the longtime listeners for remaining loyal to the show. For you first-time or newer listeners, I'm grateful for your decision to listen to the show this week. It means a lot to me. It truly does. But back to the title of this week's show, Opaque Leadership. As I mentioned in a previous segment, a huge part of the course I facilitated last week deals with leadership, a specific area of leadership, and that is what's called leading up. Now, there are many definitions to what exactly leading up means, but for this show, I'll give you the definition that I use. Leading up is the art of influencing those in higher levels of an organization through behavior and communication skills. It's a pretty simple and straightforward definition that should be easily understandable by most people. Now, how exactly does that tie into this show on opaque leadership, you may be asking? Good question. Because we often discuss on this program how elected officials actually work for the voters, which would mean that we, the people, are on a higher level in the organization of state and federal, central governments. But it is the apathy of the voters that caused that particular relationship to be inverted. It has allowed those elected to public office in our republic to feel and act as though the inverse of the relationship set out in our Constitution established. It goes even further than that, too. Most of the people that are elected do not feel as though they are elected to lead us. They feel they are put into a position to rule us. And the only way for them to maintain that status is to operate without any transparency. But we, the people, can lead up still. We can alter our apathetic behavior and get more involved. We can alter our apathetic behavior and start voting these mini tyrants out of office. Vote the clowns out that want to operate behind closed doors and do the bidding of lobbyists and corporations. Those same lobbyists and corporations that can only become and remain successful through the government usurpations of our liberty. We can communicate more often than we do now, and sometimes more forcefully with those in government that want to remain opaque. And we need to get them on record. Make them commit to a position on every piece of legislation or rule change that is proposed. More importantly, we can hold them accountable for their actions at the voting booth. The electorate, we need to change or increase our communication with these usurpers. More importantly, we all need to understand that it isn't hypocrisy when these people vote and act the way they do. It's hierarchy. They know the apathy will keep them in office, and they just don't care. They just don't care that it's only a minority of people that they are supposed to represent that is trying to force transparency and accountability on them. They know they can rely on the apathy of the general electorate voters in their districts and around the state. It has worked for them so far, and it will continue to work for them until the voters do start leading up in the future. A good way to start that is to support those candidates that will be transparent, candidates like myself, candidates that believe in the founding documents of this great country and the great state of Tennessee. Now, you can visit my website of libertyleadershipandlies.com, and you can donate there to my campaign to restore true constitutional servant leadership in the halls of government. Now, I got to say this, that message is authorized and paid for by the committee to elect Larry Linton, which I'm the treasurer of. But anyway, now we're going to close this week's show with wisdom from God's word. And today it comes to us from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. And that bit of scripture can apply to any situation, but is most definitely applied to those serving in elected office today. Those that serve in those positions have allowed bad company to ruin the morals of their states and of our republic. Until we all start leading up, it will not change. So until next week, I humbly pray and ask that you stand in the arena with me. Reveille, it's time to wake up.